Tonight, we're going to be talking about death in literature. Welcome to all of you this evening. I am personifying death and I cannot smile tonight because if I do, I look very peculiar with this skull on my face. So I'm going to try and remain serious, despite the fact that I am slightly terrifying myself with my attire. But welcome to you this evening. It's lovely to have you here with me to talk about death tonight. And I will be wearing a veil for some of this and also revealing my rather terrifying skull-like face at other times. I'm going to talk to you first about some death rituals because in the UK we're remarkably bad about talking about death, and we really try and pretend that it doesn't happen a lot of the time. I will be coming on to the literary deaths of the British, but I'm just going to talk about some round the world rituals before we get going into literature. And I would love to know from anyone who's here this evening if you have any death rituals which you could share with me, which are different to the rather non-celebratory types of death that we seem to go for in this country, particularly in literature. So do tell me if you've had any good experiences of celebrating death, which could be funerals or death rituals. Vita, great to have you here with me this evening. And I'm also seeing Clickety Croaker and viewing all sorts, and Rosebuddy. Yay! Great to have you. Oh, must not smile because it really looks a bit weird. I've also got a good skull here tonight to light our way. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit first about some death rituals from around the world. For instance, Tibetan sky rituals, which are when in Tibet they place the corpse of a deceased person on top of a high peak to be eaten by vultures and other birds of prey. It might sound macabre to foreign ears, but it's both sustainable and serves a symbolic purpose, representing the impermanence of life for followers of the Buddhist faith. And actually, these sky burials are also not foreign to other parts of the world. For instance, the Zoroastrians in Iran and in Mumbai also place their dead sometimes on the towers of silence, where they are left to be eaten by birds and any other carrion eaters, so as to sustainably eat a corpse, which frankly I think is a pretty good idea, but obviously quite difficult perhaps in many cities around the UK. Where would one place dead bodies high up in the sky? We ask ourselves. But it is kind of a cool idea, some would say. So, in a way, I'd quite be a proponent of the sky death rituals if that seemed to be an option in this modern age, but possibly it's a little bit impractical. There's also the pyres, the cremations on the pyres of Varanasi, which are perched on the banks of the Ganges River in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh, where people go to the funerary ghats in order to cremate their bodies. The demand for cremations is incredibly high in these places. On average, nearly 200 bodies are burned every day within the city, which is a pretty insane statistic. Damien, Literary Salon, I think that might be Megan. Thanks for joining me this evening and thanks for appreciating my rather terrifying costume, which I must say, whenever I catch a glimpse of myself, I'm finding really scary. Let me just demonstrate. So if I disappear for a moment and come back onto the screen, I can't help but find myself deeply frightening. And I mustn't laugh, sorry, I keep doing that by accident. So scattering ashes in Hong Kong, just going to veil myself in a minute because I really can't quite cope with myself, is another interesting modern phenomenon, though now I realise that I can't read my writing when I cover myself up with a veil. Scattering ashes at sea in Hong Kong has become a common ritual as well, because in Hong Kong, 7.4 million residents are packed into an area of less than 430 square miles. Thanks for worrying about my candles. You are right to do so. If anyone sees candles catching fire to anything behind me, just give me a shout out, because that actually really is a genuine worry. But I am trying to keep the old health and safety regulations going in my own home. So, cremations and scattering ashes at sea in Hong Kong has become a regular concept because burial plots in Hong Kong have become terrifyingly expensive and at a total premium. Frankly, there's no room for all the dead bodies. So, in the last few years, since 2005, the Hong Kong government has encouraged green burials, and they have asked families to scatter the ashes of the deceased in one of 11 gardens of remembrance or at sea. They've actually designated 3 different areas of the sea for the scattering of human remains. Quite a grim idea, but practical, let's face it. So that's Hong Kong scattering the ashes of the dead bodies. In Nigeria, there's a practice called the second burials, which is, I think, a rather great celebratory concept. According to the traditions of the Igbo tribe, an ethnic group native to parts of southern Nigeria, death does not represent the end of life, but instead the transition to a new world, until a ceremony called Ikwa Ozu, which is loosely translated as celebrating the dead, has been performed. The deceased is believed to be unable to take their place among their ancestors. While the specifics of these ceremonies differ from one community to another, one common factor is they take place after the body's been buried, leading to the tradition being referred to as a second burial. And on these lavish occasions, which last anywhere from a few days to several weeks, the family of the deceased spends a small fortune on alcohol, livestock, and entertainment. Frankly, that all sounds rather great. Megan is saying that she likes the idea of being scattered at sea, especially since it's my happy place. I have to agree. I think a lot of people nowadays do opt for the scattering of the ashes idea. And I think I would like that too. To be scattered in a beautiful place that you have always loved. For me, it would be a place in Cornwall. Another interesting death ritual from around the world is Dancing with the Dead in Madagascar, which is the world's second largest island country, where the dead continue to play an important part in family life even after they've been buried, thanks to a ceremony called Famadihana, or the turning of the bones. Every 5 to 7 years, bodies are exhumed from ancestral crypts. Family members carefully strip them of their burial garments and wrap them in fresh shrouds, after which the guests drink, talk, and dance with the departed. Just before the sun sets, the bodies are reinterred, turned upside down, and the crypt sealed for another 5 to 7 years. I think that's quite a fabulous idea too. I wouldn't mind my bones being dug up and everyone dancing with me from my family every 5 to 7 years. I'd rather they did it once a year maybe, but maybe that's a little bit impractical. The ceremony, seen as a joyous occasion, stems from the belief that the dead only move on to the next life after their homes have been after their bones have completely decomposed. That makes more sense than homes, doesn't it? Bodies that have never been exhumed exist in a kind of limbo, not part of the living world or that of the ancestors. So that's the Madagascan ritual. And Rosebuddy saying, I've seen this in a documentary. It was weird. That does sound so interesting. I would actually love to see that happen. And maybe it is a bit strange, but kind of a lovely idea. Just thinking a bit more deeply about that. My children dancing with my bones. Maybe slightly strange. But another ritual that's come over to the West has been the turning of the ashes into a crystal. And actually, that's something that my mum was really keen on as an idea, was being cremated and having her ashes made into a kind of diamond, which I did think was a great idea. And then she could have been worn as a necklace or simply kept in one's house as a beautiful crystal. But my dad was not so keen, so she was buried. But that's another interesting way to go. Another ritual from around the world is Ghana's fantasy coffins. In Ghanaian culture, the dead are believed to be much more powerful than the living, with the ability to influence their relatives. So families do all that they can to ensure the deceased will be sympathetic towards them rather than vengeful. Additionally, the dead are said to continue their living profession in the afterlife and must be buried in something that represents their job. Families commission dedicated manufacturers to create elaborate coffins, known as fantasy coffins, in any number of shapes and sizes, from sneakers to boats to Coca-Cola bottles. I've seen some of those in photos as well, and I must say I think they're amazing. And we, in fact, did end up doing something a little bit like that with my mum's coffin, because she had a cardboard coffin which we painted as a family, which was a rather wonderful thing to do because we all painted scenes from her life on the coffin. It wasn't as elaborate or as amazing as the Ghanaian coffins, which are literally in shapes relating to the people's professions, but I found that process really therapeutic, and it was a way of celebrating my mum's life. Then a couple more traditions to mention before we start talking about literature. The Filipino Igorots tribe of who have hanging coffins. They originate from the northern provinces of the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and the Igorot people practice an ancient funerary custom in which the elderly carve their own coffins. I find that a little bit too sinister, which are then tied or nailed to the side of a cliff when they die. The tradition, believed to date back 2,000 years, is said to lessen the distance between the deceased and their ancestral spirits. Before being placed in the coffin, the corpse is seated on a death chair, bound with leaves and vines, then covered with a blanket. The body is smoked to prevent decomposition, allowing relatives to pay their respects over several days. Before the casket is hoisted up the cliff face to its final resting place, mourners allow fluids from the rotting body to drip over them in the belief that it will bring good luck. That's all getting quite grim. But actually, if you look up the hanging coffins of the Filipinos, they are rather beautiful. They are hanging from cliffs with vines and flowers all around them. And the description that I've just given you with the bodily fluids dripping out of them is pretty off-putting. But the vision of the coffins is actually rather wonderful and something that you might be inspired by. I also find it quite tricky, the idea of people building and creating their own coffins. That is taking acceptance of death to a new level. Pretty impressive. There's also the modern mummies who watch over the Anga tribe of Papua New Guinea. In Egypt, mummification died out between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, but the ancient tradition is alive and well among the Anga people of Papua New Guinea. By mummifying their remains, The departed can be more easily remembered than if they were buried underground and can continue to protect their families after death. It's less prevalent than it was before. And sorry about my connection, which seems to be a little bit ropey occasionally on Instagram tonight. Not quite sure what's going on there. Tell me if it keeps going off. But although it's less prevalent now, the mummification, it is something that does still happen. It was, of course, strongly discouraged by the Christian missionaries in the mid 20th century, but it does still happen in some of the remote mountainous areas of Papua New Guinea. It's very different to Egyptian techniques, but the process involves the seated corpse being smoked, once again, over roaring flames for 3 months to prevent decomposition. When it bloats, the body's poked with sticks to drain the fluids throughout. No part of the body, including the fluids and internal organs, is allowed to touch the ground. Once the mummification is complete, the deceased is strapped to a chair and carried to a cliff-top perch where they sit alongside their elders, looking out over the village. That's quite fabulous. And Megan's just making a comment, I think referring back to my earlier thought about building your own comment. Megan saying maybe it helps you make more of your life if you're so in contact with the reality of death. We're so often disconnected from it in our culture. So very true. And I do think we should all be trying to embrace death more positively and accepting the very fact that it is going to happen, and in some ways celebrating that if we can. So many of the books that I'm going to be mentioning tonight do one way or another celebrate death or help us to accept it, and also help us to confront the reality of it, bodily fluids and all. So I'm going to start with a book that I loved this year, and then I'm going to be leaping around various different literary moments of the last 50 years. But Salena Godden's Mrs. Death was a big favourite book of mine this year, published, I think it was the beginning of this year. And Salena Godden is a poet. It's her first novel. And this book is very poetically written. I'm going to read you a little section of it so that you'll get the flavour of it. But it's very much a book that kind of rambles between different voices. Rambling isn't really the word, it's more of a rant. It is a good book, says Rosebuddy. I completely agree. It's one of my favourites. And in fact, it's one of those books that the more you read, the more you enjoy. And death is personified in this book as a black African woman in London who is pulling around a trolley full of plastic bottles and plastic remnants. And she says, who could be as little noticed as a forgotten poor black woman in London? And Salena Godden is very much making many political comments as she writes this book, not least about the Grenfell Tower disaster, which she does go into quite a lot of detail in the book, and it's quite harrowing. There is a lot of death in Salena Godden's book. She does not beat about the bush, but it's actually hilariously funny, as well as being quite profound and powerful and excoriating. So here's a little section of it to give you a bit of a taste of what it's like. The greatest trick man played was making you believe I was a man. They erased me and made you all believe that death was male in spirit. The grim reaper in a black hood with a scythe. Remarkable that nobody questioned it, really, don't you think? For surely only she who bears it, she who gave you life, can be she who has the power to take it. The one is she, and only she who is invisible can do the work of death. And there is no human more invisible, more readily talked over, ignored, betrayed, and easy to walk past than a woman, than a poor old black woman, a homeless black beggar woman with knotty, natty hair, broken back, walking ever so slow, slow, pushing a shopping trolley full of plastic bottles. By the way, Salena Godden herself reads the audio version of this book, and it is a fantastic read by her. I would thoroughly recommend it, but it's great either to read or to listen to. Death is plastic, plastic is death. When this all began, or when I began, was when life began, and that was when death began. Death is a bitch. Life is a bitch, but it's in poor taste to speak ill of the living. My sister cannot help herself but be life and living and lively. Life! Oh, she is abundant and demanding of all our attentions. My sister is an overachiever, laying eggs and fertilizing life, shitting life everywhere, muck spreading, fertile life. Life shits life. Life is everywhere. I remember when this earth world was once a rock and a cold and dark place. I was there. We were there. I can recall the terrible smell of eggs. That's the main thing I remember. The stench. My sister is stinky. Death may stink of death and of rot and decay, but life stinks too. Life and birth was always about eggs and shit. Volcanic, sulfur, fertilizer, farts. The vagina awakes, yawns, stretches and burps. And there we have blood, and from blood is life and love. And where there was love, and there was love, there was life. And there was life, there was blood. And where there was blood, there was death. Around it goes life and blood and love and death and time and space. Around and around we go, spinning on this pretty blue rock in space we call planet Earth. Fish grew legs, birds grew wings, monkeys walked upright and tall. And that's when things got interesting for me. Because then came the first fires and the first stories, the first poets and the first songs, the first paintings on cave walls, daubed in ash and charcoal. Life and death, we sisters sat side by side together and warmed ourselves by the very first fires, with the first souls dancing in the first firelight, the first handprints, stickmen images of their own selves on the walls of the caves. There were the first mirrors, man capturing man's own image, the smoke rising, the charcoal pictures telling us stories of life and death, long, tall tales of hunts and kills, boasted of around the fire and scratched into the cave walls. And what do they tell us? What does the painter ask us with these cave paintings? Why, surely just variations of the same questions that painters and poets have always asked us over the centuries. Who am I? Why am I? What is life? What is death? You can see it's the kind of book that is difficult to stop reading because she barely takes a breath. This is my printout of it. And it's a breathless kind of passage, densely written, very poetic, very beautifully written, quite profane, but also hilarious and great. And the personification of death in Mrs. Death, which I highly recommend to you, is in a way reminiscent of the personification of death in The Book Thief, which I'm sure many of you are also familiar with, possibly with the film as much as the book. But death in The Book Thief is a rather tragic personification of a person, well, a being who is death, who is reaping the souls, mostly of the victims of the Holocaust. And death in this book is a very sad, searching soul who I don't think is ever necessarily described as having a sex. In Salena Godden's book, Death is a Woman. In this one, it's unsure, I think. But in this book, death is definitely far more thoughtful, philosophical, and tragic. Salena Godden's death is a very funny and irreverent kind of being. But death in this book narrates the whole thing. And I will also read you a little bit from here to give you the vibe of what death is like in this book. And I also love the way death is personified in this book, because I think death is kind of comforting, even though he or she is horrified and heartbroken to be reaping the souls of the victims of the Holocaust. There's something loving about the way that death takes their souls in. And so, although it's tragic, death does have a sense of the tragedy. And in fact, one of the last things that Death says in this book is, I am haunted by the souls of the death, by the souls of humans, which actually Salena Godden says something very much like that too. So here's a little bit from Death in The Book Thief. First the colours, then the humans. That's usually how I see things, or at least how I try. Here is a small fact. You are going to die. I am, in all truthfulness, attempting to be cheerful about this whole topic. Though most people find themselves hindered in believing me, no matter my protestations, please trust me. I most definitely can be cheerful. I can be amiable, agreeable, affable. And that's only the A's. Just don't ask me to be nice. Nice has nothing to do with me. Reaction to the aforementioned fact. Does this worry you? I urge you, don't be afraid. I'm nothing if not there. Of course, an introduction, a beginning. Where are my manners? I could introduce myself properly, but it's not really necessary. You will know me well enough and soon enough, depending on a diverse range of variables. It suffices to say that at some point in time, I will be standing over you as genially as possible. Your soul will be in my arms. A colour will be perched on my shoulder. I will carry you gently away. At that moment, you will be lying there. I rarely find people standing up. You will be caked in your own body. There might be a discovery. A scream will dribble down the air. The only sound I'll hear after that will be my own breathing and the sound of the smell of my footsteps. The question is, what colour will everything be at that moment when I come for you? What will the sky be saying? Personally, I like a chocolate-coloured sky. Dark, dark, dark chocolate. People say it suits me. I do, however, try to enjoy every colour I see, the whole spectrum, 1 billion or so flavours, none of them quite the same, and a sky to slowly suck on. It takes the edge off the stress. It helps me relax. A small theory. People observe the colours of a day only at its beginnings and ends, but to me it's quite clear that a day merges through a multitude of shades and intonations with each passing moment. A single hour can consist of thousands of different colours, waxy yellows, cloud splat blues, murky darknesses. In my line of work, I make it a point to notice them. Okay, I'm going to stop there because, like Salena Godden, Death in Marcus Zuzak's book is also quite a rambly kind of figure. But, as I said earlier, Death in this book has enormous compassion, and that's why he's actually quite a fabulous book to read and human entity to be with. He's not a human, he is Death. But he actually does make Death seem not as depressing as Death can be in many guises. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is some of the books that make Death seem something that we can deal with. So another one to mention, which I think is really interesting, is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, in which dead souls are hanging around in this kind of place between life and death, waiting for who knows what before they go to the next stage. And in this bardo, Abraham Lincoln's son, who has recently died at a young age, I think he's only 9, they're all, he's hanging out with the other spirits in this strange interim world. And this is a book that has many, many voices of all the dead in this bardo, who are all talking about the lives that they've had and talking to each other, not necessarily understanding what is going on or even the very fact that they are dead. But this is a very beautiful book, which I would very strongly urge you to read as well. And although it is utterly tragic and in many ways deeply moving, it also has a lot of humour in it and a lot of positivity. Another one, which is strangely optimistic or helping you to accept the reality of death is one by John Crace, which I'm just trying to find you because it is one of my favourite death-related books. Sorry, Jim Crace. It's called Being Dead. And this is a book which is about a couple who are dead on a hill. And we don't know why or how they've died, but through the book you slowly discover what has happened to them. But also, as the book progresses, you hear about what's happening to their bodies as they slowly decay. And the book goes into great detail about decomposition scientifically, and Jim Crace clearly did a lot of research to find out exactly what was happening to dead bodies when they are lying outside on a hill and slowly being eaten by maggots and so on. And it's quite a fantastic amount of detail, which is weirdly something that I find quite reassuring. I don't know about you, but I think you should have a go and look at this. It very much reminds me of another fantastic book, which unfortunately I couldn't lay my hands on to show you, but I will write it in the post afterwards so you can find all these books. There's a book called Past Mortems by Carla Valentine, who is a rather fantastic writer and mortician. And she's also just written a new book, which has just come out, which is all about the true bodily realities of what would have happened to Agatha Christie's murdered victims. So that's a great book to look out for. And I'm going to be interviewing her, by the way, at the House St Barnabas in January. But her book, Past Mortems, is a really superb autobiography, memoir about how she became a mortician. But it's also very much about the process and detail of what happens to bodies after you die. And Carla Valentine explains how bodies are looked after in a mortuary and exactly the whole process of looking after the body. And Carla Valentine has also done quite a lot of crisis mortician work when, for instance, people have died in the bomb in London of 9/11 and so on. And she has a lot of really interesting insights about death from these real situations. So I would very much recommend Carla Valentine's book, Past Mortems, as an insight into the body after death. Rosebud is saying there are body farms for forensic purposes. That's a really interesting idea, which I don't know about. And sounds quite sinister, body farms. I think we need to look more into that concept. So Carla Valentine, Past Mortems, great book. Then another one, which I also find a book that gives you solace about death, is Elif Shafak's 10 minutes 38 seconds in This Strange World, which is a book that I do prescribe to people very frequently because it's a book all about the importance of friendship and a book that really makes you think about what's most important in life. It does start with a woman called Tequila Layla, who is a sex worker in Istanbul, who has died from, she's been murdered, and she's found in a dustbin. And this book takes the 10 minutes 38 seconds after she dies to describe her life. So theoretically, you have consciousness in your brain for 10 minutes 38 seconds after you die. And during these minutes, Elif Shafak describes Tequila Layla's life, going back chapter by chapter through sensory perceptions. So she talks about the smells that remind her of particular people in her life. So each chapter takes a different smell, like it might be lemons or it might be cardamom coffee. or it might be tequila. And she describes a different part of her life and then how it led to her being friends with someone. And the book then takes the five friends who are the key people in her life and talks about how they are affected by her death. And it's an incredibly moving book. And although it's brutal and tragic, it does also have an element of magical realism which takes you with the spirit of Tequila Layla along what happens to her after death. So I would very much recommend this book as, in a way, a positive look at death and the moments after death, but also a book to remind you of the importance of forging deep friendships and keeping your friends close to you as much as you can. A book that my friend Sam mentioned to me in relation to this book, in a way, because she felt that it was another book that made her feel positive about death, is Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is a book which talks about an AI, an artificial friend, in fact, who goes through the book looking after a girl. And I can't really give too much away about the whole book. I don't really think I can say that much about it without giving it away. But we know Kazuo Ishiguro also wrote Never Let Me Go, which is a book about organ donations. And the book that I'm talking about, Clara and the Sun, also has an element of artificial friends looking after humans. I will say no more. But there's something about the relationship of Clara to the sun, it's called Clara and the Sun, to mortality, to humans, and to death, which I think is really powerful, interesting, and moving. So that's Clara and the Sun, and thanks to Sam for mentioning that to me for another great book, which is in some ways comforting when we think about death. Another couple of books to mention in terms of taking comfort from ideas about death. There's a rather fabulous Japanese book, If Cats Disappeared from the World by Genki Kawamura, which describes a 30-year-old narrator who discovers that he has months to live. His doctor gives a diagnosis with no ambiguity. He's got a brain tumour. He lives alone. He's alienated from his family, with only his beloved cat, Cabbage, for company. And while pondering what to do with those months, he's visited by the devil in the form of a more outgoing version of himself. And the devil offers him a Faustian pact. He says that in exchange for making one thing disappear from the world each day, he can have an extra day of life. So our hero then has the terrible responsibility of what he could take away from the world and what should stay in order to buy himself another day of life. So should he take away, for instance, mobile phones, or should he take away cars? Should he take away films? Should he take away cats? Hence the title, If Cats Disappeared from the World. So it's quite a playful but very moving and thought-provoking book, which also makes you think about mortality. And another one is What Dreams May Come by Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson, I'm sure you know, is the writer of the very brilliant I Am Legend, which is a really fantastic zombie novel, one of the first ever zombie novels, which I actually really loved and found very moving too. And he wrote this book, What Dreams May Come, which is all about the afterlife. It's a kind of philosophical exploration of life after death, in which afterlifers go to a place called Summerland, or the third sphere, where all their wishes and desires come true. So that's a really interesting book, looking at the idea of the afterlife and thinking of the fact that I don't have that much time. I'm going to skip the next little section, just far too much to talk about. But I will just mention The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold, which is another really interesting book about the afterlife, which I have met quite a few bibliotherapy clients who've taken comfort from this book, even though it is a brutal novel because it's about the rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl. It is a really interesting one in terms of thinking about the afterlife. And in the novel, the heroine describes her death at the very beginning of the book. So she is looking back from the perspective of her afterlife at what happened to her. And she describes her rape and murder, which is all very harrowing. But she then spends the rest of the book in her version of the afterlife trying to help her parents find justice for her and catch her killer. But she goes through various different stages of the afterlife, and all of them are really what she would most aspire to in the afterlife. So she has friends and popularity and discos and games and places to go, and she actually has a charmed existence in her afterlife. So there's something quite comforting about it in some ways, as there is in The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, which is also a fantastic book which talks about ghosts who adopt a live human baby. And the ghosts in the book are incredibly wise and warm and generous spirited, and they give an impression of a rather warm and cozy version of the afterlife. Another book which I recommend frequently for people who are worrying about death is Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is, yes, a great big tome, and yes, it's written in verse. There are other modern versions of it. This one is a brilliant version that you can actually dip into and pick up, and you're always going to find a great story in it. This version is translated by David Rayburn from the original Latin. And why I love it is because it has all kinds of great stories in it, which are frequently myths that you will know already from other sources. But for instance, there's the story of Icarus, the story of Arachne, Pyramus and Thisbe, Narcissus and Echo, Actaeon, Hercules, chaos. There's the beginning of time, the beginning of the world, all told by Ovid from myths that he knew from ancient times. And the reason I think it's great to read when you are preoccupied with death and worrying about death is it has a really fantastic sense of eternal change, the wheel of fortune, the wheel of change, and the way that things change from life to death eternally. So women in this turn into trees, trees turn into streams, streams are naiads, and rocks break forth and let people out of them. Everything is always changing, changing from life to death and back again to life. So there's a rather fabulous sense of reincarnation and of eternal change and of people going from life to death, to nature, to rebirth, to growth. So this is a very comforting book, many would say. And another interesting take on death, which I frequently recommend to people, is David Eagleman's lovely little book, which packs an amazing amount into such a slim volume, subtitled 40 Tales from the Afterlives. This is a book that I have mentioned more than once on these occasions, so I won't talk about it a lot, but it's a brilliant book to read aloud with a partner or friend. Each story is only about 3 pages long, and each story takes an idea about what might happen after you die and plays with that idea, but they're secular ideas, they're not religious ideas, and it really makes you appreciate life as we know it, and it really helps you to try to make the most out of life while you are here on this world. So that's a really inspiring book to read that does really make you appreciate being alive. Similarly, Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt is a great children's book all about the idea of eternal life and whether we do want to cling on to eternal life. And that's one that I would very much recommend to you to read both as a child and an adult. It's a great one to share with children or to read aloud as adults too. In the novel Cure, we talk about fear of death, and let me just plug the novel Cure for one moment. Brilliant Christmas gift if you're getting to that point. Look at this beautiful book. It's the perfect book to give to any bibliophile. And in this book, we have a cure for the fear of death. And I won't read you the whole entry because we have two books that we mention, White Noise by Don DeLillo and also 100 Years of Solitude. And I'm just going to read you the bit about 100 Years of Solitude. The other cure to keep by your bed is 100 Years of Solitude. This novel about the Buendia family of Macondo can be read over and over as the events occur in a sort of eternal cycle. And it's so densely written that you'll find new gems and revelations every time. Spanning a century as it does, death occurs often and matter-of-factly, and the characters accept their part in the natural order of things, an attitude which, in time, may rub off on you. And if it doesn't, keep reading, over and over again. And one night, perhaps, as you wearily reach the last page and begin again, you'll start to see the need for all good things to eventually come to an end. So that's 100 Years of Solitude, which is a book that I deeply love. And there's some really beautiful deaths in this book, which you have to read the whole book to find. But a bit like the death in Elif Shafak's 10 minutes 38 seconds, there are elements of magical realism in this book. After all, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of the most famous magical realists, and there are some deaths where people disappear, are lifted into the air as if they're ascending to heaven. There are other deaths where a woman changes into a cloud of yellow butterflies. And that reminds me of a book that I was talking about last week, a book that I have only just discovered, which is why it's in my mind. But it also has a great, oh dear, there we go with the candle. It's okay. There's no fire risk, you'll be glad to hear, but I will just relight that candle that just fell out of my fantastic candle holder. So there's a really great scene. Sorry, I'm just going to get closer again so that I can be with you fully and you can hear me all right. Where there's a death right at the end of the novel. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler. If anyone doesn't want a spoiler from this book, Moonstone by Sion, then block your ears for the next minute and I'll wave when you can listen again. It's a very short section, but it is rather beautiful and reminds me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Carlson is only 50 yards short of the leper hospital when he experiences a sudden sensation of weightlessness. Glancing at his hands, he discovers that he can see right through them. He gropes for his body and finds that he is clutching at thin air. He can't feel a thing apart from the wing beats where his heart used to be. A middle-aged man comes around the corner of the hospital. This is Sigurdur Agstrimson, a farmer from Daly on Lake Hopesdown, who's been a patient here since he fell ill with the disease 6 years ago. For an instant, he thinks a young man is standing before him, but at the next moment, a black butterfly appears, bigger than any he has set eyes on before. It flutters up to him and settles on the stump of the ring finger of his right hand. A thought crosses his mind. My Gisli would appreciate this. I won't read you more, but that's a moment where, in death, a man changes into a black butterfly, which I do feel is a rather beautiful moment and very reminiscent of 100 Years of Solitude. People who blocked their ears for that moment can come back, because I'm not doing that spoiler anymore. And I've just seen that Felix has joined. Hi, Felix. Great to have you here with me this evening. I wonder where you're joining from. Are you in Chamonix? Maybe not. So I'm going to end the session with a couple of things, because there's still lots of books I want to mention, but I don't have time. I'm just going to tell you before I read a final story, which will take a few minutes, the antidote to death, my personal antidote, my favourite book, Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins, which is a really fantastic book all about seeking eternal life and then deciding whether eternal life is all it's cracked out to be. But it's a book full of love, life, laughter, orgasms, and baths. And it is truly exhilarating and very upbeat. And that's a book that I would urge anyone to read if they are feeling depressed about death. But I'm now going to, just mention one more thing. Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is a really fantastic book that I have talked about on a few occasions, also has some really fantastic thoughts and ideas about death. And there's a really marvellous scene where Hamlet, who is the son of Shakespeare, I don't want to give too much away. Anyone who hasn't read it yet, close your ears for a minute, because this is a spoiler. Hamlet decides to take the place of his sister, who is dying of the plague, and Hamlet attempts to cheat death. And I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of it before I read a last story, because it's such a great scene. This is where the two twins are together. Judith, who is the sister of Hamlet, the twin sister, identical twins, is dying of the plague, and Hamlet is realizing that he will be completely lost without her. And I urge you all to read the book, because it's a really fantastic read, very beautiful, very profound, and brilliantly written. And this is describing Hamlet's twin sister. Her eyes glitter with a strange silvery light. She's worse, he can see this. Her cheeks are sunken, white, her lips cracked and bloodless, the swellings in her neck red and shining. He comes to crouch next to his twin, careful not to wake his mother. His hands finds hers, their fingers twined together. He sees Judith's eyes roll back in her head, once, twice. Then they open wide and slide towards him. It seems to take her a great deal of effort. Her lips curve upwards in what might be a smile. He feels a pressure on his fingers. Don't cry, she whispers. He feels again the sensation he's had all his life, that she is the other side of him, that they fit together, him and her, the two halves of a walnut. That without her he is incomplete, lost. He will carry an open wound down his side for the rest of his life, where she had been ripped from him. How can he live without her? He cannot. It is like asking the heart to live without the lungs, like tearing the moon out of the sky and asking the stars to do its work, like expecting the barley to grow without rain. Tears are appearing on her cheeks now, like silver seeds, as if by magic. He knows they are his, falling from his eyes onto her face, but they could just as easily be hers. They are one and the same. You shall be well, he murmurs. He grips her fingers in anger. I shall not. He passes his tongue over his lips, tasting salt. I'll come with you. We'll go together. Again, the flicker of a smile, the pressure of her fingers. No, she says, his tears glistening on her face. You shall stay. They need you. He can feel death in the room, hovering in the shadows, over there beside the door, head averted, but watching all the same. always watching. It is waiting, biding its time. It will slide forward on skinless feet, with breath of damp ashes to take her, to clasp her in its cold embrace, and he, Hamnet, will not be able to wrest her free, should he insist. It takes him to, should they go together, just as they always have. Then the idea strikes him. He doesn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. It occurs to Hamnet, as he crouches there next to her, that it might be possible to hoodwink death, to pull off the trick he and Judith have been playing on people since they were young, to exchange places and clothes, leading people to believe that each was the other. Their faces are the same. People remark on this all the time, at least once a day. All it takes is for Hamnet to put on Judith's shawl or for her to don his hat. They will sit at the table like that, eyes lowered, smiles concealed, and their mother will place a hand on Judith's shoulder and say, "Hamnet, can you bring in the wood?" Or their father might come into the room and see what he thinks is his son, dressed in a jerkin, and ask him to conjugate a verb in Latin, only to discover it is his daughter, hiding her laughter, revelling in the illusion, and she will push aside the door to reveal the real son, hidden away. Could he pull off their trick, their joke, just once more? He thinks he can. He thinks he will. He glances over his shoulder at the tunnel of dark beside the door. The blackness is depthless, soft, absolute. Turn away, he says to death. Close your eyes, just for a moment. He slides his hands underneath Judith, one palm under her shoulders, the other under her hips, and he shunts her sideways towards the fireplace. She is lighter than he expected. She rolls onto her side and her eyes open a crack as she rights herself. She watches, frowning, as he lays himself down in the dip her body has made, as he takes her place, as he smooths his hair down on either side of his face, as he pulls the sheet up over both of them, tucking it under their chins. They will look, he is sure, the same. No one will know which is which. It will be easy for death to make a mistake, to take him in her place. She is stirring beside him, trying to sit up. Nay, she is saying again. Hamnet, nay. He knew she would know straight away what he was doing. She always does. She's shaking her head, but is too weak to raise herself from the pallet. Hamnet holds the sheet fast over both of them. He breathes in. He breathes out. He turns his head and breathes into the worlds of her ear. He breathes in his strength, his health, his all. You will stay, is what he whispers, and I will go. He sends these words into her. I want you to take my life. It shall be yours. I give it to you. They cannot both live. He sees this and she sees this. There is not enough life, enough air, enough blood for both of them. Perhaps there never was. And if either of them is to live, it must be her. He wills it. He grips the sheet, tight in both hands. He, Hamnet, decrees it. It shall be. That's Hamnet. Fantastic book. Can death be cheated? Can somebody take somebody else's place and hoodwink death? Read the book and you will find out. So I am going to finish by reading a story from this fabulous collection by Philip Pullman, which are rewritten tales, the Grimm tales, in a really great collection. There's 50 tales, and one of them is called Godfather Death. So people that want to stay with me now, the story will take about 10 minutes to read. Anyone that wants to leave, I completely understand. It's 10 o'clock and you might want to end on that note, but you also have the option of lingering with me for a bedtime story, which is called Godfather Death. It's only a couple of pages long, so it's going to be probably less than 10 minutes, but I'm going to read it to you with a skull in hand. And people that are leaving this evening, by the way, next week I'm going to be talking about the Booker Prize books. So do join me for that. And Rosebudy's asking, will there be a list of the books mentioned this evening? There will. I will probably put it up tomorrow morning. I don't know if I'll get it together tonight. So I'll put it on my Instagram story, and I will also make it a post on my Instagram page so that you can find that list of books. And thank you so much for joining me. But anyone that wants to stay for just a little bit longer, I will now read a bedtime story. Hope that this poor connection is not going to carry on. I do apologise for the connection this evening. It's a little bit frustrating, but it seems to be better now. So, people that are staying with me, I'm now going to read Godfather Death. And by the way, thanks for joining me, everyone else, this evening, and I'll see you next week. A poor man had 12 children and had to work day and night just to get them a little food to eat. So when his wife gave birth to a 13th, whoops, there goes my candle. Just going to have to sort that out a little bit before I really get going with this story. When he gave birth to a 13th, she did, he didn't know what to do, and he ran out into the road thinking he might as well ask the first person he met to stand godfather. The first person who came along was God himself. Since he knew everything, he didn't have to ask what was in the man's mind. My poor man, he said, I'm sorry for you. I'd be glad to hold your child at his baptism. I'll look after him. Don't you worry about that. Who are you? Said the man. I am God. Well, be on your way. I don't want you for a godfather. You give to the rich who don't need it, and you let the poor starve. Of course, he only said that because he didn't know God's purpose in being so kind to the rich and so cruel to the poor. He went on his way, and the next person he met was a gentleman dressed in his finest clothes. I'd be glad to help, he said. Make me your child's godfather, and I'll give him all the riches in the world, and I make sure he has a good time too. And who are you? I'm the devil. What? I don't want you for a godfather. You deceive people and lead them into sin. I've heard all about you. So he went on, and the next person he met was an old man tottering towards him on withered rags. Take me to your child's godfather, the old man said. Who are you? I am Death, and I make everyone equal. Then you're the one, said the poor man. You take away the poor and you take away the rich. You shall be godfather to my child. That's a wise decision, said Death. I'll make your child rich and famous. Anyone who has me for a friend can't fail. Next Sunday, then, said the man. Make sure you turn up on time. Death appeared at the baptism just as he'd promised, and swore all the vows and behaved with perfect propriety. So the boy grew up, and when he became of age, his godfather came to the house and said, Come with me, young man. The boy followed his godfather out into the forest, where the old man showed him a particular herb. This is a present from your godfather, he said. I'm going to make you a famous physician. Whenever you're called to the bed of a sick person, just look around and you'll see me. If I'm standing by the patient's head, you can tell his family that all will be well. Then give him a little of this herb any way you like. Give him a leaf to chew, make him some tea from the flowers, grind his roots up into a paste and make the pills. Doesn't make any difference. In a day or so, he'll be perfectly well again. But if I'm standing at the foot of the bed, he belongs to me, remember. You have to say there's no help for him. No doctor in the world could save him. Now this will always work, but watch out. If you give the herb to anyone who belongs to me, something very bad will happen to you. The young man did as his father said, and it wasn't long before he was the most famous doctor in the world. People were amazed by his ability to know at once whether the patient would live or die, and they came from every country in the world to consult him and gave him so much money that he soon became a very wealthy man. Now it so happened that the king of that country fell ill. The famous physician was sent for, and the courtiers asked him to say whether the royal patient was likely to survive. However, When the young man entered the bedroom, he saw his godfather standing at the foot of the bed. The king was doomed. This wasn't what the king's family wanted to hear, of course. If only I could contradict my godfather just once, thought the physician. He'll be angry, no doubt, but I am his godson after all. Maybe he'll overlook it. I'll risk it anyway. So he turned the patient round so that Death was standing at his head and gave him a decoction of the leaves to drink, and pretty soon the king was sitting up and feeling much better. However, immediately the young man was alone. Death came to him, frowning darkly and shaking his finger. "You tricked me," he said. "I take a very dim view of that. I'll overlook it this time because you're my godson, but try it just once again and you'll be sorry, because I'll take you away with me when I go." Not long afterwards, the king's daughter fell gravely ill. She was his only child, and the king wept day and night until his eyes were so swollen he could barely see. He announced far and wide that whoever could cure her would marry her and inherit the kingdom. Naturally, the young man was among those who came to try, and once again, when he entered the sick room, there was Death standing at the patient's feet. This time, though, the young man hardly saw his godfather, because after one look at the princess's face, he was lost. She was so beautiful that he could think of nothing else. Death was frowning and snarling and shaking his fist, and the young man hardly noticed. He turned the princess around, gave her 2 pills, and presently she was sitting up, with the colour returning to her cheeks. But Death, having been cheated for a second time, was in no mood to wait. He seized the physician with his bony hand and said, "Right, my boy, you're done for now." And he pulled him away from the princess's bedside, and away from the palace, and away from the town, and the ice-cold grasp was so firm that the young man couldn't pull free, no matter how hard he tried. Death led him to a great cavern under the mountains, where thousands and thousands of candles were burning. Some of them tall, some of them medium-sized, and others so short they were on the point of going out. In fact, at every moment some candles did go out, and others elsewhere suddenly came alight, so that the little flames seemed to be leaping about from one spot to another in constant movement. "See those candles," said Godfather Death. "Everyone alive on earth has a candle burning down here. The tall ones belong to children, the middle-sized ones to married people in the prime of life, and the little ones to old people. Mostly, that is. Some people who are only young have a very short candle." "Which is mine?" said the young man, thinking that his candle was bound to have a long way to burn down yet. Death pointed to a little stump where the flame was already guttering. The young man was horrified. "Oh, godfather, dear godfather, light another one for me, I beg you. I long to marry the princess. You know why I had to turn her round. I fell in love with her at once. I couldn't help it. Please, dear godfather, let me live my life." "That's impossible," said Death. "I can't light another one without letting the first go out." "Oh, I beg you, please, put this one on top of the new one so it can carry on burning when the first one's finished." Death pretended that he was going to do that, and he took a new long candle and set it upright before taking the little stump that was nearly out. But he was determined to have his revenge, and in tipping it over to light the new one, he let the old flame go out. The physician fell to the ground at once, for he was equal to everyone else. He had fallen into the hands of Death. On that deathly note, I will end this evening's session all about death in literature. Thank you so much for joining me. I know there are many works of literature that I have not touched on this evening due to lack of time. If anyone wants to share any with me, please do. I would love to hear from you. You can write to me on Twitter or on Instagram, or you can email me, ella@ellabertu.com. You can also buy me a coffee on ko-fi.com. And thanks so much to the people that have done that and who have sponsored me this year. Feel free to continue to do so. It is hugely appreciated. Thank you. And I will see you next week for another session of Bibliotherapy Live. Good night.